On a quiet June morning in 2011, the small lakeside town of Willowbrook was just beginning to stir. The air was crisp with the promise of a warm summer day, and the surface of Lake Meridian lay smooth as glass. Mark Henderson, a well-liked high school biology teacher, loaded his old green canoe under the roof of his truck while his 10-year-old son, Jake, bounced excitedly on the balls of his feet. The boy had been begging for this trip all week, just the two of them, out on the water like they'd done so many times before. Lisa Henderson stood in the driveway, arms crossed against the morning chill, watching her husband secure the last strap. She had packed them a lunch, sandwiches, apples, and Jake's favorite chocolate chip cookies, and tucked it into Mark's waterproof backpack. "Be careful," she said, more out of habit than real concern. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman, the kind of man who could start a fire with damp wood and navigate by the stars. Lake Meridian wasn't treacherous, not like some of the rivers he'd tackled in his younger days. This was just a simple father-son outing, the kind of memory Jake would carry with him forever. Mark ruffled Jake's hair and promised they'd be back by dinner. The boy clambered into the truck, his small face pressed to the window as they pulled away. Lisa waved, then turned back to the house, already mentally ticking through her to-do list. She'd clean the kitchen, maybe start laundry, and if she had time, she'd weed the garden. Normal things, mundane things. The kind of things she'd later wish she could remember in perfect detail, if only to prove to herself that this day had once been ordinary. At the public boat launch, Mark unloaded the canoe while Jake scampered down to the water's edge, skipping stones across the still surface. A few other early morning fishermen nodded in greeting, but the lake was mostly deserted. Mark checked the weather on his phone: clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions. He helped Jake into his life jacket, then pushed the canoe into the shallows. The plan was simple: paddle to the northern end of the lake, where a small island offered a good spot for lunch. They'd explore the shoreline, maybe look for frogs or interesting rocks, then head back by mid-afternoon. The last person to see them was an elderly man named Harold, who was fishing from the dock. He'd watched Mark and Jake glide away, the boy's laughter carrying across the water as his father taught him the proper way to hold a paddle. Harold would later tell police that nothing seemed amiss. The canoe moved steadily, cutting a clean path through the water until it disappeared around a bend. By 3 p.m., Lisa started glancing at the clock. Mark was usually punctual, and Jake would be getting hungry. She tried Mark's cell, no answer. Not unusual, given the spotty reception near the lake. But by 5 p.m., when the sun was dipping low and the kitchen table was still empty, her stomach tightened. She called Mark again, then again. Then she dialed the local ranger station. The search began at dusk. Flashlights swept the shoreline while boats crisscrossed the lake, their beams cutting through the gathering dark. Lisa stood on the dock, arms wrapped around herself, straining to hear anything over the hum of the outboard motors. The sheriff tried to reassure her. Maybe they'd pulled ashore somewhere. Maybe Mark's phone had died, but his words rang hollow. By midnight, the truth was sinking in. Mark and Jake were gone. The next morning, the search intensified. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and divers probed the lake's depths. Volunteers fanned out through the surrounding woods, calling their names. But the lake gave up nothing: no canoe, no paddles, no scraps of clothing. It was as if the water had swallowed them whole. Rumors spread quickly in a small town. Some whispered about sudden squalls or underwater currents, though the weather had been calm. Others pointed to the lake's darker history, drowning accidents decades earlier, stories of a witch's curse that old-timers still half believed. But the most unsettling theory came from a park ranger who noted that the canoe's absence suggested something deliberate. Canoes didn't just vanish, and neither did people. Lisa refused to consider the worst. Not yet, not while there was still hope. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, the question gnawed at her. How could two people disappear without a single trace? 2 weeks after Mark and Jake vanished, the search teams had all but given up. The lake had been dragged, the woods combed, and the surrounding towns alerted, yet there was nothing. No sign of the bright green canoe. No torn life jackets washing ashore. Not even a single footprint leading away from the water. It was as if the two had simply evaporated into the summer air. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a local fisherman named Roy Benson made a discovery that sent a ripple through the investigation. He was casting his line near the lake's eastern shore, an area rarely frequented by boaters due to its thick overgrowth and rocky shallows, when something caught his eye, a single paddle floating near the reeds. It wasn't just any paddle. The moment Roy pulled it from the water, he recognized the small, hand-carved initials on the grip. M.H. He called the police immediately. When detectives examined the paddle, they noted something strange. If Mark and Jake had capsized, the paddle should have been waterlogged, maybe even battered from drifting in the lake for days. But this one looked almost pristine, dry inside the shaft, with no algae or scratches. It hadn't been in the water long. Even more baffling was the location. The eastern shore was upstream from where Mark and Jake had launched. Given the lake's gentle current, any debris from an accident should have drifted west, not east. The only way the paddle could have ended up where it did was if someone had placed it there deliberately. Detectives questioned Roy, but he had no reason to lie. He was just a retiree who fished the lake every morning. Still, the discovery reignited the investigation. Divers returned to the water, focusing now on the eastern shoreline. Search dogs were brought in, sniffing for any trace of human scent. But once again, the lake gave up no answers. Then, a possible lead. A truck driver named Dale Cooper, who had been passing by Lake Meridian on the day of the disappearance, contacted police. He remembered seeing 2 canoes out on the water that morning. One bright green, matching Mark's, and another, a faded blue one, trailing at a distance. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. But now, with the news swirling, it struck him as odd. Police tracked down every registered canoe owner in the area, but none matched the description. When they pressed Dale for more details, his story wavered. He admitted he hadn't gotten a clear look at the second canoeist, just a vague silhouette. Then, just as suddenly as he had come forward, Dale retracted his statement, mumbling that he must have been mistaken. Detectives suspected he'd been pressured, but without proof, the lead went cold. Meanwhile, Lisa was left with more questions than answers. Why would someone plant Mark's paddle? Who was in that second canoe? And why would a witness suddenly change his story? As the months stretched into years, Lisa refused to let the case fade. While the police moved on to newer investigations, she kept searching, poring over missing persons forums, hiring private investigators, and even appearing on local news programs to plead for information. The town of Willowbrook had largely accepted that Mark and Jake had met with a tragic accident, But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had happened. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange details that didn't add up. Then, in the spring of 2015, while sorting through old tax documents in Mark's home office, she stumbled upon a small, unmarked envelope tucked inside a seldom-used filing cabinet. Inside was a key, the kind used for safe deposit boxes. Lisa's hands trembled as she turned it over. Mark had never mentioned anything about a safe deposit box. The next morning, she visited every bank in town, asking if they had a box under Mark's name. Finally, at a small credit union on the outskirts of Willowbrook, a teller recognized the key. With the proper identification, Lisa was led into a back room and handed the box. What she found inside turned her blood to ice. Neatly organized inside were documents that made no sense, a life insurance policy she had never signed, bank statements from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and a passport with Mark's photo but a different name, Daniel Reeves. The expiration date was recent, issued only months before the disappearance. Lisa's mind reeled. Had Mark been planning to leave her? To fake his death and start over somewhere else? But that didn't explain Jake. Mark would never have abandoned their son. Unless he hadn't. She flipped through the passport again, her breath catching, when she noticed a second smaller document tucked behind one of the pages, a child's passport, issued under the name Ethan Reeves. The photo was undeniably Jake. Lisa sank into the chair, her thoughts spinning. If Mark had planned this, why stage a disappearance on the lake? Why not just leave quietly? And why leave behind this key, hidden but not too hidden, as if he wanted her to find it eventually? She took the documents to the police, but their response was lukewarm. Without evidence of foul play, they saw it as a possible case of voluntary disappearance, a man fleeing his life, taking his son with him. But Lisa knew Mark. He wasn't the type to run. And even if he had, he wouldn't have left her in agony, wondering if they were dead or alive. Desperate for answers, she hired a forensic accountant to trace the offshore account. The trail led to a shell company registered in the Bahamas, but the money, nearly $200,000, had been withdrawn just days before the canoe trip. Where had it gone, and why? Then another discovery. Buried in Mark's email archives, which Lisa had accessed with the help of a tech-savvy friend, were encrypted messages sent to an anonymous address. The few that had been recovered were cryptic phrases like, "It's not safe anymore," and "They're watching." The last one, sent the night before the trip, read, "If anything happens, look for the truth in the usual place." Lisa searched there, home top to bottom, but nothing else turned up. What was the usual place? The lake? The canoe itself? Or something else entirely? The more she uncovered, the more she questioned everything she thought she knew. Had Mark been in trouble? Was someone after him? Or had he been leading a double life? One thing was certain, this was no accident. And if Mark and Jake were still alive out there, she would find them. No matter what it took, 12 years had passed since Mark and Jake vanished into the stillness of Lake Meridian. The case had long gone cold, relegated to dusty file boxes and the occasional true crime forum discussion. Lisa had never stopped searching, but hope had become a fragile thing, something she carried carefully, like a candle in the wind. Then, in the summer of 2023, a kayaker named Sarah Wexler made a discovery that would shatter everything. Sarah was exploring a secluded cove on the lake's northern edge when her paddle struck something metallic beneath the water. Curious, she dove down and felt the unmistakable curve of a submerged canoe. When police divers retrieved it, the truth was undeniable. The serial number matched Mark's missing green canoe. But what they found inside defied all logical explanations. Canoe had been deliberately sunk, its interior filled with carefully arranged rocks to weigh it down. Even more chilling, there were no bones, no clothing, no signs that Mark or Jake had ever been inside when it went under. The craft showed no damage consistent with capsizing. Instead, the evidence pointed to something far more calculated. Someone had staged this. Forensics took weeks, but the results were worth the wait. A single fingerprint lifted from the canoe's interior handle belonged to Carl Riggs, a former colleague of Mark's at Willowbrook High. Police records showed Carl had been fired months before the disappearance following a heated argument with Mark over missing funds from the school's science department budget. At the time, Carl had threatened Mark, but no one took it seriously until now. Detectives tracked Carl to a rundown trailer park outside Portland, where he'd been living, under the name Charlie Redmond. When questioned, Carl initially played dumb, claiming he hadn't seen Mark in years. But when confronted with the fingerprint evidence, his demeanor shifted. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he muttered, "You don't understand what really happened." That day, meanwhile, Lisa received an anonymous letter postmarked from Nevada. Inside was a blurry photograph of a gas station surveillance, still dated 2 years after the disappearance showing. A man with Mark's build holding hands with a boy who looked eerily like an older Jake. Scrawled on the back were 3 words: "He's still alive." Police reopened the case with renewed urgency. Dive teams returned to the lake, this time searching the shoreline near where the canoe was found. Buried beneath years of fallen leaves, they discovered a rusted hunting knife with traces of blood on the blade. The DNA matched Mark's. The pieces were coming together in ways Lisa had never imagined. Carl hadn't just killed Mark, he'd staged an elaborate disappearance. But the photo suggested a far more complicated truth. If Mark was alive, had he been running from Carl all these years? And where was Jake in all of this? Then came the final twist. While searching Carl's trailer, police found a map of Lake Meridian with a single location circled, not where the canoe was discovered, but a remote cabin deep in the woods. When SWAT teams raided it, they found chains bolted to the floor, empty food tins dated from 2011, and child's drawings scratched into the walls. The cabin told a story no one wanted to believe. Mark and Jake hadn't drowned. They'd been taken. And someone had kept them there. For how long, no one knew. But the biggest question remained, where were they now? The answer would come from the most unexpected place of all, a voicemail left on Lisa's phone in the dead of night. The voice was hoarse, barely recognizable, but the words were clear. The voicemail ended abruptly, leaving Lisa frozen in the dim glow of her phone screen. That voice, older, rougher, but undeniably Mark, sent 12 years of grief and doubt crashing through her all at once. She played it again, then a third time, as if convincing herself it was real. The call had come from a blocked number, leaving no way to call back. She immediately dialed Detective Morales, the lead investigator who had stuck with the case long after others gave up. Within hours, police traced the call to a payphone outside a truck stop in rural Idaho. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed a gaunt, bearded man in a baseball cap making the call just before midnight. Though his face was partially hidden, his posture matched Mark's. More startling was the figure waiting in the shadows nearby, a tall young man, roughly Jake's age, glancing nervously at the surrounding darkness. Detectives pieced together a timeline. After escaping whatever hell Carl Riggs had imprisoned them in, Mark and Jake had been living off-grid, moving between remote towns under false names. The offshore money Lisa discovered had funded their survival, but paranoia kept them running. Carl, it turned out, hadn't acted alone. He was connected to a smuggling ring Mark had accidentally uncovered during his school audit. These weren't just embezzlers. They were dangerous. The breakthrough came when an Idaho state trooper pulled over a beat-up RV for a broken taillight. The driver, who gave his name as Dan Reeves, acted strangely, too calm, too rehearsed. When the trooper ran his license, the system flagged it as potentially falsified. Backup was called, but before they arrived, the man whispered, "Call Lisa Henderson. Tell her we're done hiding." It was Mark. In an interrogation room hours later, the full story spilled out. Carl had intercepted them on the lake that day, forcing them at gunpoint to paddle to a remote shore. The staged canoe sinking was meant to buy time while he transported them to the cabin. Mark described months of captivity, of whispered plans to escape when Carl's guard was down. When a winter storm knocked out the cabin's generator, Mark overpowered Carl, fleeing with Jake into the freezing night. But freedom came at a cost. Certain the smugglers would hunt them, Mark used the offshore funds to disappear completely. He taught Jake to live without leaving traces. Cash transactions, no social media, constant movement. The hardest part, he said, was knowing Lisa believed they were dead. He'd left the safe deposit box clues hoping she'd eventually understand, but never imagined her search would uncover Carl's crimes. The reunion, when it finally came, was nothing like Lisa had dreamed. The man who hugged her wasn't the Mark she remembered. His eyes held a decade of fear, his hands scarred from struggles she could only imagine. Jake, now 22, stood stiffly beside him, a stranger in her son's body. The joy was there, but so was the weight of all those lost years. Carl Riggs was arrested on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The smuggling ring was dismantled weeks later. But for the Hendersons, the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding trust, mourning the time stolen from them, learning how to be a family again. In the end, the truth was both a relief and a wound. They were alive, but they'd been out there all along, just beyond the light, waiting to be found.